We're in 31 custom directives, and we're going to look at this also for kind of basically security, but it can be used for different things. The first thing is if we look in our guide.md, we will just have a quick look at a proposal in TC39. And this is what's called decorators. Decorators are basically functions that decorate other functions without changing them, but giving them extra properties and functionality. And the only thing I really want to draw attention to is how in TC39 then the proposal is for using them. And you can see that this decorator here of define element has this @ symbol, and it basically decorates the class C below it. And you might have seen this in various TypeScript versions, but this is essentially what a decorator is. And the reason I show that is because we are going to be using what's called custom directives that take on this form here. And we can use them at all different levels on fields or on queries. In this case, we're going to look at it actually on this particular query of view user. And we're going to add in this auth decorator. And these are the names that we've picked ourselves. I've called it auth, and this field here requires, I've picked it myself, but basically it requires a role of admin. So to be able to use this view user, we would need to be at an admin level. And it's basically adding in an extra level of authentication or even authorization to this query here. It can also work on individual fields too. So if we look at user.js, we can see we've got different roles on our users. On our type definition, we've just seen this, that we're adding in this custom directive. And if we look at our index.js, we're pulling in this auth directive, and we declare in our server Apollo schema directives auth, which is our special kind of custom directive, and that's linked to this export here. And if we go into auth directive, we can see how we can create this special decorator effectively. Now a lot of this is just boilerplate. We need to basically extend the schema directive visitor. We're creating our requires is defined in our schema, and we're having a required role, and we're getting it off the arguments and requires, so it can pick out actually this value here, what we're passing in. And the boilerplate is that we need to resolve the field. And basically what we do is we get all the information in, and we can just basically do something a bit like middleware before we then execute it. So here I'm just finding out all the details that we've got on our user object in context. I'm also picking up the args ID, the ID and the value there. And basically I'm logging out some information that we've got here. And then I'm basically saying if it has a token, it's authenticated. I'm also doing a second check. If it has a role of admin, then it can pass through. If it fails any of these, it basically gives an error. Otherwise, it just proceeds on. A bit like what we saw before in the authorization and authentication, but this is basically working it on a particular field or on a particular query rather than on the server instance itself. So we come into here, and then in our resolvers, we can see a view user. We're going to basically pull out some information. We return here, and it's just very simple. Basically, we're returning back some data just to see how all this works. And in the type definitions, we've seen that. So what we can now do is if we go to index, and what we'll do is let's file that up. So we're in, where are we? Are we in CD, and we'll go CD 31 custom directives. And let's have a quick look. And in package JSON, it is basically we have an npm run dev, npm run dev. Just wait now for that to come in. Let's just see what it should be giving. Index, yes. Server ready. Good. Let's open that up. And what we can do is we can close all these down. So we look, we've got a view user, ID, first name, last name, role, what else we've got, email. And if we run this, we can see we get it back because Larry's got a role of admin. And if we look in our auth directive, we know we're basically what we're looking for is getting out the role here. We're having that it must have the role of admin as well as it must have a token. So a bit before we can see token and admin. So if we come back to index.js, and if we sort of change this, firstly let's take out the token and see what we get back. So just put that there, come in here and refresh, view user null, it's not returning anything. Because basically in our auth directive, when we come back, we're returning data. If it doesn't have it, if the context doesn't equal data 8, we apply the resolve there, we do additional checks, and then we return the data back. And on that function, if it doesn't work in our type defs, then basically we don't get anything back, only if we are required admin. It's not returning back an error message, though we could throw a message if we wanted to. And if we go back into index.js again, and let's change this to user and see what happens here. If we come back, refresh, you need following rules. And I think what I did before is I didn't refresh the browser. It says here you need the following role status 500. And if we come in here, we change this back to admin. Come back here, refresh, because we changed the schema and the files. That one works there. If we come back here and take out and put change that, come back in here, refresh, view user null, nothing comes back in there. And why does that happen? Because if we go to auth directive, if we don't have a token, we're basically applying this function here, await. So what we should really do is if we take this out here, so if context, if there is a token, we can get the data back. We can see there's slightly additional checks if it's not authorized. So what we should really do is if context, well, what we'll do is we'll change this so that if it isn't, it'll send back a different message. But nonetheless, we can see how that all works because this is basically going back here. There is no taken, data is null. So this is like a silent one, and here is one that basically throws an error. So this will kind of, if there is ways to check if not, so what we'll put here is if no token, data will end up being null. Down at the bottom here, because we get back here, we're not doing anything. We only actually add the information, so return null. We could return back something totally different as a message here in data, but otherwise if we have the data, we take the original resolution and apply this and basically apply the arguments that have been passed through. Sort of boilerplate in terms of custom directives. But what we can also do is if we go into our guide.md, when we look at our schema directives here, we can see you can do all sorts of different things and on different places. And implementation in terms of deprecated, you can sort of uppercasing strings. If you want to do something where they become uppercased, you can basically apply the same formulas there. Formatting dates, we saw that differently, formatting dates with our custom scalars, but we could also do that here as well. And it's sort of basically the boilerplate, setting the schema directive, getting the value in, changing the resolve function, and then spitting out something different. So this is basically custom directives that can be used to transform on a field level, or it can be on a query level. It's not used on the client side, and the reason we don't do that is Apollo says although you could put it on the queries, it basically means that the client would have to know quite a lot about what each of these things do, and it wouldn't be available necessarily in the docs. Because if we come back here and look in the docs, when we're here, you see view user, admin ID, we click on that ID, role, we're not actually seeing all those decorators, so it might be hard for a person to determine what's actually needed. It's better done server side. although there are, as we'll see later, there's a skip and include. So basically, in a sense, what we're doing here is this can be used anywhere we want, and it could be put we could have it on here, or we could have it on the query itself, depending on how we make our custom directives. So this is another way to do authentication, authorization at a much lower level, and we can change. And as we've seen here in the auth directive, we can fail silently, i.e. that if we don't have a token, it works its way through, it just gets null data. But if it is authorized, we can actually change the data there, it gets put into that, then basically some additional checks, and obviously we can change this whole format the way we want. So that is custom directives for GraphQL in Apollo.